Hello. In this video, we're going to talk about how to write an argument analysis paper. All right. So first, we're going to talk about what's unique about philosophy papers more generally. So a philosophy paper is neither a research paper, nor is it an exercise in literary self-expression. Instead, it's a reasoned defense of a thesis. So notice that a reasoned defense of a thesis isn't the same thing as simply giving your opinion. They're importantly different. Clarity is valued over style in a philosophy paper, which means that sometimes it's okay to repeat yourself if you're using a word to identify something and you're talking about that thing over and over again. Use that same word. It's best to use the first person I while writing. We'll get a sense of this when I talk about the introduction and the conclusion of this paper, but this can be pretty different from papers in our other classes. And the paper for this class is going to follow a very precise format. The point of this paper is to closely investigate an argument that you want to think more about in a systematic way. So again, the paper for this class is going to follow a very precise format that I'm going to lay out now. So the parts of an argument analysis paper are as follows. We begin with the introduction, then the presentation of the argument, including where it is that you found it. You'll write the argument in premise-conclusion form, carefully explain what the argument does well and what rules it follows, identify when and how the argument's flawed and what rules it breaks, explain what could be done to fix these flaws in the argument and what the argument would look like with these flaws fixed, and then finally the conclusion. So generally speaking, you can think of each of these as a separate paragraph. Now, writing the argument in premise-conclusion form is kind of a funny paragraph, but otherwise each of these items should require at least one paragraph. So if we count writing the argument in premise-conclusion form as its own paragraph, your paper should have 7 paragraphs at least. Now I'm going to talk about each of these items in a little bit more depth. Okay, I'll begin with the introduction. Introductions for philosophy papers are very boring. To begin, you write the thesis that you're going to defend. Then, you explain in detail exactly how it is you're going to defend it. And I recommend that you write the introduction and conclusion after you finish the rest of the paper. It just sort of flows a little bit more naturally, and then you can know exactly what you did in the paper so you know to say what you did. And I'm very serious about including the introduction and conclusion in exactly the way that I'm outlining in this video. You lose points if you sort of freestyle your introduction and conclusion. Now, a word here when I say in exactly the way that I'm outlining in this video, I don't necessarily mean that I want you to cut and paste what I have in this video. Instead, I want you to take the concepts that I talk about in the introduction and the conclusion and apply them in the way that I outline here. For this paper, the main thesis that you're going to be defending in most cases is going to be something like, I'm going to argue that this argument is effective, or maybe not effective, or maybe mostly effective, or mostly not effective. So one of those 4 things, generally speaking, is going to be the thesis that you defend. All right, now I will give you an example of what these kinds of introductions look like. So, as I said, I want you to begin by presenting your thesis. So, in this paper, I'm going to argue that an argument for why the Big Mac is the best hamburger in the world that I found on the McDonald's website is mostly not effective. So, as we see, I'm working in the first person, which again might be different, but this is your paper, and you should write it from the first person. All right, so that's what it looks like to present your thesis, and I recognize that that you're going to argue that an argument is a little bit awkward of a phrasing. If you can find a better way to phrase it, that's awesome, and if you do, I will copy you moving forward. All right, the next part of the introduction is to explain how you're going to defend your thesis. So we'll see, here's me presenting your thesis. This is what I mean when I say how you're going to defend your thesis. So, In this paper, I'm going to argue that an argument for why the Big Mac is the best hamburger in the world that I found on the McDonald's website is mostly not effective. To do this, first I'm going to present the argument and where I found it, and then give the argument in premise conclusion form. Next, I'm going to carefully explain what the argument does well and where the argument is flawed. Then I'll expand on what could be done to fix these flaws and explain what the argument might look like if these flaws were fixed. Finally, I'll conclude talking about what I learned from carefully analyzing this argument. So this is what I mean when I say that I want you to explain how it is that you're going to defend your thesis. Okay. Now, onto the presentation of the argument. In this part of the paper, I want you to begin by presenting the argument in narrative form, right? And what I mean by that is written out in sentences in a paragraph, right? And then in this form, explain each premise and how the premises lead to the conclusion, all right? You should present the argument in the clearest and strongest way possible. And this may be difficult with especially bad arguments. It can be hard to present them in a clear and strong way, but I want you to do that. I also want you to make sure to present the argument in as neutral a way as possible with regard to what you think about the argument. I don't want to read your presentation of the argument and know which side it is you fall on. In fact, ideally, I should be able to read your whole paper and not have any idea at all what you think about the argument that you're looking at. Don't forget to include the argument's conclusion, or what you think the conclusion is, and mention where you found the argument, and also include a citation to the argument so that I can find it. Now here, it's important to actually find the argument that you're going to consider expressed somewhere in the world. Right? Sometimes we have these arguments in our mind and we think that this is what our opponent's arguing or whatever. I want you to actually find a version of that argument presented somewhere in the world so that you can cite it, so that I can find it, and so that we can work from there. All right. Then I want you to write the argument in premise conclusion form. So we've been practicing this quite a bit. And writing the argument in premise conclusion form kind of helps us clarify what exactly the argument is by defining each premise and then finally the conclusion. Don't forget to write the premises, in a natural order, and remember that it's okay to change the wording from the way that they appear in the way that you find the argument out in the world. It's okay to change. You don't want to change the meaning, of course, but it's okay to change the wording so that things flow better. All right. Next, identifying what the argument does well. So for this part of the paper, I'd like you to begin by going through the first 6 rules and identifying what the argument does well from those 6 rules. It's also possible that other rules that we've considered might apply, and if they do, make sure to mention them. The argument may also do other things well that we haven't considered in class. It's also important to mention these things. Even if you don't exactly have a perfectly clear way of expressing what it is that the argument is doing well, I would encourage you to give it a try. And we may come across a rule that covers what it is that you're thinking about, but you don't have to worry about that now. It may be possible that there are very few things that the argument does well, okay? But I want you to make sure that you identify at least one thing. So if you pick a very bad argument, I want you to make sure that you identify at least one thing that the argument does well. And I want you to reference all of the first 6 rules in either this part of the paper, which is what the argument does well, or the next part, which is about what the argument does poorly. Okay, so the next part, identify where the argument is flawed. So for this part of the paper, I'd like you to begin, again, by going through the first 6 rules and identifying what the argument doesn't do well from these 6 rules. It's also possible that other rules that we've considered might apply, and of course, if they do, be sure to mention them. The argument may also be flawed in ways that we haven't considered in class, so make sure to mention these flaws, explaining them as best you can, all right? So do not say that the argument that you're considering has no flaws or that it's flawless. You're required to identify at least one place where the argument may be flawed, right? So one way you might be able to do this is to consider what people who disagree with your argument say about it. And this can be a great place to find flaws with your arguments. This is especially important if you're trying to identify flaws with arguments that you think are strong or that you particularly agree with. All right? And I want you to reference all of the first 6 rules again in either this part of the paper or in the previous part. All right. Now, next, for this part of the paper, I want you to explain what could be done to fix the flaws in the argument and explain what the argument would look like if these flaws were fixed. If you're considering an argument that you think is strong, it's important to identify something that could be done better, right? Smart people obviously disagree with your argument, okay? But why do they disagree? And how can you respond to this disagreement? If you're considering an argument that you do not think is very good, there's going to be a lot of things that need to be fixed. Explain what these are and what the argument might look like if they are fixed. It's possible that the argument might not work anymore if the problems with it are fixed. And this is especially true with arguments that are based on false claims or that use bad logic. Okay? So this is all right. Just say so. Just explain that, look, once I fix these things, the argument does not work anymore. All right. Finally, the conclusion. Conclusions are as boring as introductions for philosophy papers. I want you to begin by identifying the thesis that you defended and explaining exactly what you did to defend it. Then, conclude with 3 or 4 sentences expanding on what you learned from working through this case study analysis. All right, and I have the star there because this part is not a normal part of a philosophy paper, the expanding on what you learned. This is something that is unique to me. So, in any case, this is an example of what I want for the conclusion. In this paper, I argued that an argument for the claim that the Big Mac is the best hamburger in the world was mostly not effective. To do this, first I presented the strongest version of the argument that I could, and then presented the argument in premise-conclusion form. Then I carefully explained what the argument did well and where it was flawed. I discovered that although a number of the premises were flawed, there was one premise that was very compelling. I also explained what could be done to fix the flawed premises, and then explained what the fixed version of the argument might look like. All right, so that's identifying the thesis and how it is that you defended it. Now, this is what I have in mind for explaining what you learned. Of course, you can expand on this in any way you want, but here's kind of the neighborhood of what I'm talking about. I learned a number of valuable things from looking closely at this argument. First, I learned that although I agree with the argument's conclusion that the Big Mac is the best hamburger in the world, I discovered that there's a very difficult thing to argue coherently for. When I carefully assessed the premises of the argument I was considering, I discovered just because I agree with something, this doesn't mean that it makes the argument better. I also learned that even bad arguments can have at least some parts that are compelling. I've not noticed this before I completed this assignment. Okay? So that's what I have in mind for the conclusion. Okay, a few tips. So, I want you to use MLA formatting when you cite where it is that you found your argument and any other citations that you need to make in the paper. I don't anticipate there being many other than the one where your argument is located, but in the case where you need to cite something, use MLA format. And to be clear, I will not grade you on your citation style. I need to be able to find the argument, and I am not an expert in MLA formatting, so but it's a nice opportunity to practice it because you will need it in your English classes. So use MLA formatting to cite where you found your argument. Now, this paper is a chance to carefully think about an argument and to try to clarify your thinking with regard to that argument. And this isn't an opportunity that we often have in our lives. And so I would encourage you to take advantage of that. We're actually going to get 3 shots at it this quarter. So, carefully pick arguments that you are curious about and that you want to think about more carefully. Spend some time brainstorming before you begin so that you know exactly how you're going to work through each step of the paper. You can do this in however it is that you brainstorm best. And as I've said earlier, I think that it's pretty helpful to write the introduction and the conclusion last. So write all the rest of the paper, and then once you know what it is that you did in the paper, write the introduction and the conclusion. You can use any font and any font size that you want for this paper. It does not matter to me. And there are no requirements for length. However, the paper needs to be as long as it takes for you to complete each part. And generally speaking, papers are about 3 pages double-spaced, so about 1.5 pages single-spaced. But spacing and font size and font are up to you. I could not care less. Extra stuff to fill space is no good. I do not care about extra junk. I don't care how long the paper is. I very clearly laid out what I want you to talk about in each paragraph, so please do that and everything will be fine. If you have more to say that doesn't fit in the paper, however, feel free to include an appendix where you can write anything extra that you like, okay? So, and anything that you include in your appendix won't be graded. So I include this option because sometimes students work through these papers and then they have like a lot of extra stuff that they really want to say and they really want me to read, but it doesn't fit within the format of the paper. So if you find yourself in this situation, and I'll be clear, not many students do, but some do. If you find yourself in this situation, just put an appendix and then write whatever the extra stuff is that you need that doesn't fit in the regular scope of the paper, and I'll be happy to take a look at it. But again, it does not affect your grade if you do this. So, and finally, my views, or what you think my views are, don't matter. So please don't take them into account as you write your paper. All right. Now I'm going to end with the questions that I ask when I grade your paper. So how you can use the end of this presentation is, when your paper's done, you can go back through this list of questions and make sure that you've completed all of these things in the best way possible. So these are the questions I'll ask when I grade your paper. Does this paper properly follow the instructions for the introduction to a philosophy paper? Does this paper clearly present the argument that it's considering, including where the argument was found? Does this paper include the argument written in premise-conclusion form? Is this an accurate rendering of the argument? Does the paper carefully explain what the argument does well and reference the applicable rules from our textbook, including identifying at least one thing the argument does well? Does the paper identify how the argument is flawed and reference the rules that it breaks, including at least one place where the argument can be improved? Does the paper reference all 6 of the first 6 rules and any others that we've covered that are applicable? Does the paper explain what could be done to fix the flaws in the argument and what the argument would look like with these flaws fixed? And finally, does the paper properly follow the instructions for the conclusion to a philosophy paper, including explaining what was learned from the assignment? So these are the questions I ask myself when I grade your paper. And finally, if you have any questions, please let me know.